like I said yesterday, thank you to Pedro and everyone else responsible for organizing this. I'm really excited about the direction of this Planetarium History initiative. It's something very near and dear to my heart. And yeah, so my goal in this talk is to kind of go over some of the basic archival challenges of doing work on early planetarium history. So yes, as you can see, one of the biggest challenges of this early history is that most of it no longer exists. And this is because of the almost wholesale destruction of many of the early planetariums during the Allied bombing campaign of Germany near the end of World War II. So, for example, or I should say in the first slide, this is an example of some of the destruction suffered by the Deutsches Museum. Near in the early 1945. Many of you might be familiar with this history or not, but the Deutsches Museum was the host of the very first planetarium. It opened in 1925, and the planetarium that was in the Deutsches Museum was the product of a almost 2 decades long collaboration between the Carl Zeiss Company of Jena and Oskar von Miller, the director and founder of the Deutsches Museum. So a prototype to the planetarium that was housed in the Deutsches Museum first premiered in 1923, but 1925 was the first time it was open to the public, accessible to the public. And as I've talked about in earlier talks, was wildly successful. However, as you can see, it was almost completely demolished during the bombings, along with many of its records. We also have, as another example of destruction, the Berlin Planetarium. The Berlin Planetarium was one of the early planetariums. It opened in 1926. It was located really in the center of the city, so, or the center of Berlin in the 1920s. We would now consider it in West Berlin. It was near the zoo. It was on the same plot of land as the zoo in the corner of the large garden, the large city park called Tiergarten. And it was also, sort of interestingly, right across the street from a number of very popular music halls and cinemas, where a lot of very famous films of the 1920s were screened. In the 1943 bombing of Berlin that took out a number of other very famous landmarks, it also, as you can see, completely destroyed the planetarium. This bombing was also responsible for a large destruction of the zoo, which makes sense, it was right next door. And produced a lot of anecdotal stories about lions and elephants roaming the streets of Berlin. So one of the other places that was destroyed that is sort of notable for this project was the Zeiss Company itself. So this is the old campus of the Zeiss Company. It was located in the downtown of Jena, which is a small town in Eastern Germany. As you can see, almost completely reduced to rubble. So what happened, and so the result of this rampant destruction is that those planetariums are gone, their projectors are gone, and almost all of their records are gone, which produces a very interesting challenge for the historian attempting to piece together the experience and the history of these early planetariums. There is one saving grace, however, which is that although the Zeiss Company was largely destroyed, several of their records managed to survive. And even though most of the records from these individual planetariums did not, they, because they were owned by, or because their projectors were produced by Zeiss, would regularly send back reports about how the planetarium was going. So we do have a small, but fairly robust sample of letters, correspondence, operational notes from some of the planetariums that are no longer existing. One of the things that's interesting, I should say I'm focusing here on planetariums that were destroyed during World War II, but there are also planetariums that were destroyed as part of World War II that were not part of the bombings. And specifically, I'm talking about the Nuremberg Planetarium as a kind of illustrative case study of this. So you can see the Nuremberg Planetarium on the right. On the left is an excerpt from a far-right, sort of proto-Nazi journal called Der Stürmer, which is sort of infamous. Becomes one of the most extreme voices of the Nazi party, and it's edited by the local Gauleiter, so the local big Nazi official, Julius Streicher. And so you see here, he says basically, those of you who are walking along the street in this part of Nuremberg, might see a building that looks a little bit like a synagogue, or maybe a new mosque. But this is no synagogue or no mosque. It's a planetarium. And he goes on to talk about how the planetarium maybe is sort of like a synagogue or a mosque. And this was the beginning of a very concerted campaign on his part to take the planetarium down. And later in 1933, it was actually fully demolished. So we have here this sort of graveyard of destroyed planetariums, which leaves the question of how do you tell a story about this? And what this has produced actually is a very interesting space in which you are sort of doing a history in the gaps, a history of all the things that you can acquire surrounding the planetarium, leaving a kind of planetarium-shaped hole in the middle. So I've been looking at a lot of cultural magazines, a lot of correspondence, a lot of reports from people who went to the planetariums and talked about their experiences elsewhere, a lot of correspondence that these planetariums had with other institutions that may have survived, and a lot of study of the sort of cultural context of these planetariums. What this approach forces you to do is to really situate these planetariums in their cultural context and to think about how they were experienced by the people who went to them, people who went to other things as well, who went to movies. Maybe they went to a planetarium and then went to a show, or they went to the planetarium and then they went to a zoo. How they experienced the planetarium as part of a constellation, pun intended, of other experiences offered to them in this interwar period in Germany. So I think it's a very exciting approach, and I think it opens up a lot of possibilities. You know, over time, the Carl Zeiss Company, this is just a picture of their more modern facility that was rebuilt in the 70s. They have a very active archive and a wonderful archivist who has been helping a lot in this project. And slowly, you know, I think we are beginning to assemble a sense of what these early planetariums were like.
If there is there any itching question or comment for Katie? If not, I'm sure this is very thought-provoking. Thank you so much, Katie, and I really appreciate that you touched this idea that the planetarium needs to be culturally situated, because we tend to think of the planetarium as the projector and the building, etc. There's so much more to it. We have a question here, which is a very interesting one, so I'll take this one from Melanie Isenbarger. What are some of the oldest artifacts you are working with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm interested in sort of where the planetarium comes from. And to that extent, I have been doing quite a bit of work in how the planetarium emerges from a number of different earlier solar system oriented medium, if that makes sense. It's sort of generally broad, but in that category, I include things like orreries, early orreries, which many of you are familiar with, these geared models of the planetarium. Especially over the course of the 19th century, the orreries that become very popular start to get increasingly big. And the largest one, David can correct me on the details here, but I believe the largest one is the Russell orrery. Spans about, I want to say 20 feet across, maybe it's like somewhere in that range. It's quite large. And so what I see there is this increasing desire to get to something like an immersive experience, if that makes sense, making something bigger and bigger and bigger to try to grasp the scale of what we're actually talking about here. One of the other prototypes that's interesting to me is something like the Atwood sphere, which is in Chicago, which belongs to a much older tradition of these kind of immersive globes that you can walk into, and like holes will be punched in the ceiling to mimic the effect of stars. Also, I think like moving pictures and other kinds of sort of spectacular entertainment that are popularized from the 18th and the 19th century are also at play here when understanding the planetarium. And to Heather's question, have I found anything that has really surprised you? I think something, I've talked about this before, but something I found sort of interesting and surprising is that there is this sort of sense, and I think a lot of this is based on that anecdote I shared about the Nuremberg Planetarium being perceived as like too synagoguish or something like that, is that there's a sort of understanding that the Nazis are like, after the Nazis come to power, the planetarium, which represents a kind of like technologically oriented cosmopolitanism, falls into disfavor. And so the Nazis either neglect them, or they tear them down, or they just have nothing to do with them. in reality, what I found was that the Nazis were actually very interested in these planetariums for a number of different reasons. One, they used them as military training sites to train the Luftwaffe and other and submarine pilots to train for celestial navigation. But also there seems to be something about the planetarium in this period that was very appealing to them. And I have a much longer argument about that I don't want to get into. But basically what it boils down to is that what one of the things the planetarium is very popular for in this period is shows that give people an excuse to escape from the city, if that makes sense. So like the city is really loud, it's really like overwhelming. So you go to a planetarium, you have a chance to chill out. And what you are gifted when you go to this planetarium is this very old sky. A lot of the most popular shows were about like, imagine the sky of medieval Germany, imagine the sky of prehistoric Germany. And that this kind of like romanticization of rural German life is actually very sympathetic to a lot of Nazi ideology about like the soil, about nationhood and this kind of thing. And so the planetarium actually becomes used as a propaganda machine in a lot of, I found a lot of different examples of shows that were popular during the Nazi period that talk about like the celestial origins of the German folk, or like rewriting the constellations to be German. There's one show that has a swastika constellation that they project onto the sky. So there's this very interesting ideological thing going on there. So yeah, I will leave it there. Oh, also to Junshin's question. Yeah, I've been looking at a couple of others. It's sort of outside of my wheelhouse at the moment, but I know that there are other planetariums that survived the war in different other parts of the European continent. Vienna, of course, was destroyed, but the Rome Planetarium, I think, is still open and still in operation. And there's a couple of others as well that I think would be useful to look at. I just haven't gotten to them yet.
Thank you so much, Katie, for this fascinating presentation and discussion. Thanks, everyone. So the comments and questions keep flooding in, but in order to move on, we definitely need to have specific events, and perhaps we should have one just to discuss this fascinating work of yours, Katie. But let's move on. So our next speaker will be David Dvorkin, another member of our working group. David got his PhD in the history of astronomy in 1978. He's a senior curator of history of astronomy at the Smithsonian Institution, National Air and Space Museum. So David curates the museum's collection relating to space astronomy, as well as 20th and 21st century ground-based technologies that are related. So David's interests include the history of 20th century astronomy, the rise of astrophysics, the origins of the space sciences into contemporary times, and the topic for today's talk, the 50-year gestation of a major planetarium for Washington, DC. David is currently working on a biography of space astronomer George Curators. David, please.
Okay, so you can see the Zeiss on the right and just a few statements on the left. Mm-hmm. Our Model 6A Zeiss was a gift of the Federal Republic of West Germany to anoint the opening of the National Air and Space Museum on our bicentennial, July 1976. The first, I'll just say briefly, this is after a 50-year gestation of having a planetarium major planetarium in Washington, D.C. Zeiss approached the Smithsonian in 1927, offering to find a funder, and the secretary of the institution at that time, Charles Greeley Abbott, or he was assistant secretary actually, about to become secretary. He just could not bring himself to deal with it because the Smithsonian was so, you might say, overtaxed, overcommitted, and there were a lot of political things going on that were reducing the support for science. And he was also trying to retain it as a scientific institution. Anyway, it was operational from 1976 to late 2019. And there were hourly automatic shows. They weren't on the hour, but they were at some random part of the hour, which made programming kind of weird. But they were 7 days a week. There were over the period of its operation, there were some live shows. sometimes 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 a week, but usually 1 to 2 a week. These are things like Noontime with the Stars, and there were evening shows. There were some where various classes were invited, but they were not invited to school shows, live school shows. Typically those were automated also, but not always. The location of the planetarium was pretty invisible. It was on the 2nd floor west of the Milestones Gallery, but it was not visible from Milestones. It's basically sat behind an F-104 behind a wall that depicted the outline of the planetarium. The professional staffing began in the 1970s with about 12 people. They had full production capability, and they did a lot of very creative producing. They did not produce a lot of shows. Many of them had dual appointments. By the 1980s and 90s, the staff had shrunk to 6 and to 4. At one point, when I was chairman of the Space Science and Exploration Department, we took the planetarium under our wing to hopefully save it from the director. That helped a little bit. Finally, in the 2000s, there was a staff approximately of 3. They also lost their technical support, and when it closed, it was down to 1.5 with no technical support. But they relied a lot on Skyscan, a very fine contractor, to help manage the planetarium. So it's had quite a history, and now its future history, while certainly not in doubt, there will be a theater, but it will be completely automated and computerized, and the programming is to be determined. Now let's see, how do I go beyond the slide? Oh, here we go. Okay. During the process of dismantling it, Andrew Johnson from the Adler very, very kindly devoted a good bit of his time to help the contractors, since there was no staff available to take the machine apart, and our collections people were overly taxed in closing the western half of the museum, which the planetarium is part of. And I should say the context is that we're rehabbing the entire museum, so everything had to move. So here they're trying to determine how the altitude thing can be disconnected so that it can be removed. We have videos of this. I didn't want to subject you to the videos. So it's just that we needed Andrew's expertise, and very much appreciated him. Here is the reinstalled projector, not in its final place, but in a temporary storage place in the Udvar Hazy Center, our auxiliary museum out in Dulles, California. Sorry, Dulles, Virginia. And we managed to retain it through a good bit of politicking and cajoling within the museum. The chief curator at the time, Peter Jacob, who just retired last week, did a brilliant job of convincing collections that it is a simulator. And so it's going to go in the simulator part of the Dulles Center. Now, the Dulles Center is a display storage place, so there won't be any extensive exhibitry around it. And we could not save any of the electronic operational system. Neither is the electronic system original. It has been changed many, many times, so that was not taken along with it. I wanted to keep the console, but that was not possible. So this is what we have now. It will be on display as the Hazy opens. There, of course, are other little items that went along with the original donation, such as this etching of Albert Einstein, and we since had replaced that with a scale model of the Zeiss, which we also are preserving for hopefully future display. We also found in the second floor mezzanine above the dome an enormous cache of original artwork for the theater. And I just include a few examples here. There were some, I think, let's see, what do I say here? 1,300 or so panoramic scenes and elements of scenes by some many by known artists, planetarium artists. They will be culled, and it is not my responsibility, thank God, to do that. That will be the art curator and possibly some of the others who are more closely involved in cultural and artistic collecting. Here's another example. It was called Ice Planet. And then we also had a lot of, as you might think, space flight shows. And this LEM console is an example of a framework that we projected on the dome. And in ways that I don't recall how they did it, you could see an image in the interior black screen. And this was part of a panorama that went all the way around the horizon. Another example, my favorite, when I started working at Griffith in the early 1960s, my favorite AV, and the only ones we really used other than slides, were sunset and sunrise. Those were our spectaculars, and I like this one, very nicely done. The Smithsonian overall, of course, is a collection of bureaus, and our sister museum, the American Museum of National Museum of American History, NMAH, does collect also. They have collected the Spitz A2 that we found at Montgomery College, and they were closing it or they were upgrading it, and I think the dome is still there, so I hope they upgraded it. And also from various times, we have a collection of small toy planetariums and other popular culture things. So in addition to collecting and preserving the material heritage, it's very important to say that we have done a decent job of collecting the records. And since this is an institutional operation, the records go to the archives. We wish our own museum manuscripts division pay a little more attention, but these records are preserved. And we have the records from the beginning, some of it from well before the beginning, as you can see in the last one. And writing the history of this, Jun Xin has done a wonderful job of putting together the rationale for the educational component of this museum, how they used an educational component in the post-Sputnik era to justify not only the planetarium, but the entire Air and Space Museum. So there is that to consider. So what is the future of the planetarium? Well, we know that the dome will continue and it'll be completely electronic. But right now, with the entire museum being gutted, we saved what we could save. And so that's basically my report.
Thank you very much, David. Is there any quick question or comment for David? Okay, David, there's one here on the chat from Melanie Eisenberger. What you find most impressive still about the Spatiarium?
What do I find most impressive?
Yes, still.
In the 1980s, how many people came to it and visited and appreciated it, and to some extent, how many people were surprised that we had a planetarium.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's an interesting one here, just a quick one. What's from Dr. Barth? What will be done with the culled art? Might some be sold to support the museum?
Haven't thought about that, and I don't know it's possible legally.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, we do have a program of donating them to other museums and other institutions if they are so in their mind. And what I'm hoping is that, well, we already have a pictorial collection of all 1,300 images. And that would be up to our registrar and our administrative staff. If we were to sell them, that would be a long process of dealing with legal issues. They were purchased, of course. They were made on consignment. How those are then distributed, it would be possible, actually, but I would say complex.
Thank you very much, David, and everyone. There were a few other questions and comments, but we need to move on. Our next speaker will be my other colleague, Mike Smale. Mike is the Director of Theaters and Digital Experience at the Adler Planetarium. He leads a team that handles all aspects of Adler's two-dome theaters, as well as in-museum digital content. And Mike is interested in depictions of astronomical imagery and concepts in popular media and optomechanical planetarium projectors. Speaking of which, Mike has a very nice story to tell us about the original projector of the Adler Planetarium Zeiss Mark II, which has gone through long and winding road, being decommissioned, and eventually came back to Adler. Mike, please.
Great, thanks, Pedro. So this talk will be an abbreviated version of a talk I gave at a Dome Dialogues webinar a few weeks ago. So let's see here. You should think I should be able to figure out screen sharing. There we go. My apologies. All right, so title slide looks good, Pedro? Yep, excellent. All right, thank you. So this will be an abbreviated talk. So my apologies to the non-native English speaking audience members. I will be talking kind of quickly and hopefully the captions will help with that. So as Pedro just hinted at, the Adler Planetarium recently reacquired our original Zeiss Mark II. That was the first planetarium projector in the Western Hemisphere. Its location had been a bit of a mystery among planetarium historians and enthusiasts, so I'm thrilled to be able to finally fill in the gaps. First up, a bit of a backstory. The Adler Planetarium opened on May 12th, 1930, with a Zeiss Mark II at its core. In 1960, the Adler upgraded their projectors, adding individual projectors for the 42 brightest stars, positioned in 2 rings or roughs just below the starball. There was also a new moon projector, and maybe most importantly, new chromium-coated photo-engraved star plates, which replaced the original hand-punched copper plates. These upgraded Model 2s and Mark IIs were known as Model 3s, while newly built factory projectors from the same time period were labeled as Model 4s. Now, in 1968, William Clark, president of Observadome Laboratories in Jackson, Mississippi, asked the Adler if we would be willing to sell our projector to the city for installation in their to-be-constructed planetarium. An agreement was reached, and in order to meet funding timelines, Observadome acted as sort of a go-between, purchasing the projector from the Adler and then reselling it to Jackson. December 31st, 1969 was the projector's last day in operation. Technicians from Adler and Observadome spent the next 2 weeks carefully disassembling the projector, and they even packed it back in the same crates that the Adler's new Zeiss Model 6 had just arrived in from Oberkochen, Germany. Now, the Russell C. Davis Planetarium in Jackson, Mississippi opened in 1978, but it opened with a Minolta S4 projector. So where was the Adler Zeiss? Well, it turns out when the Jackson staff investigated the costs of updating the projector, it would be well over $200,000. And when they reached out to planetarium manufacturers for bid quotes, they received an offer from Vulex, who was then Minolta's US distributor, that was about $100,000 less. Vulex also offered about $30,000 in trade-in for the Adler's old Zeiss. It was a pretty good deal. And as a result, the Adler Zeiss found itself shipped off to Vulex's Long Island warehouse space, where it sat for the next year or two. Now, in 1980, Vulex Audiovisual Incorporated went bankrupt. the freight and storage company that owned their warehouse began calling up Zeiss Planetaria around the country, looking for some facility that was willing to pay $10,000 for the Adler's Zeiss. One of their calls went to Sam Mims. Sam was one of the 2 planetarium curators at the Louisiana Arts and Science Center in Baton Rouge. Realizing the danger of this historic artifact potentially being scrapped, Sam got a few investors together, including his father and his co-curator, Wayne Coskrey, and they agreed to purchase the projector. At this time, the LASC Planetarium was also a Zeiss Model 3, having originally been installed at Los Angeles' Griffith Observatory as their original Model 2. But Sam and Wayne didn't have plans to use the Adler's Zeiss for spare parts. They wanted to put it in the hands of someone who could put it to use or preserve its historic value. Now, the Baton Rouge group ran ads in Astronomy and Sky and Telescope, even the Planetarian looking for a potential buyer. This ad is actually from the 2nd issue of the 1983 Planetarium. Well, by 1987, they finally found a buyer. Don Grider, who's a solar engineer from Mechanicsburg, Ohio, arranged to purchase Adler's Zeiss with the goal of reassembling it inside his workshop. Now, this was the last time anybody saw or heard about the Adler's Zeiss for over 20 years. Now, some of you may recall the Adler found ourselves thrust into the US political spotlight in 2008 as one of the presidential candidates derogatorily accused another candidate of requesting a $3 million earmark for the Adler to buy an overhead projector. As a result, we found ourselves making quite a few comments and press statements and events trying to explain the difference between the latest and high-end planetarium technology and a commonplace everyday classroom overhead projector. Well, Don Grider happened to catch a piece on NPR, US National Public Radio, about this, and he gave the Adler a call, offering his services to potentially manufacture new parts for our then almost 40-year-old Zeiss Mark VI. During the call, Don also let slip that, oh, hey, I happen to have your old planetarium projector in crates at my warehouse. This led to a series of phone calls and in-person visits over the next few years, but by the end of 2012, Don had dropped out of touch. On February 17th of this year, I received a voicemail forwarded from the museum's main line. It was Don Grider's son, Ken. He was making arrangements to clear out the barn, the family's barn warehouse, and wanted to know if we were interested in purchasing our Zeiss. On February 29th, a small group from the Adler drove out to the Grider farm to attempt to verify that it, 1, was Adler's Zeiss, and 2, to inspect the condition of the parts. So what did we find? Well, outside of the barn, we found a giant crate, well covered by tarps and tires and old computer parts. And once we got inside of that crate, we found the center axle of a Zeiss planetarium projector of that time. This was an incredibly heavy crate, over 3,000 pounds. So heavy that once they offloaded it, they couldn't even get it into the warehouse. Now, inside of the warehouse, we found accessories all over the place, bits and pieces of every part of a Zeiss planetarium you can imagine. Cardinal direction signs, arrow pointers, lamp housings, slides, lens and star plate assemblies, way more than I could even fit on this one slide. We found a crate with a pair of star balls. Northern Hemisphere star ball, Southern Hemisphere star ball. So far, so good. We found a crate with a Southern planet cage apparatus. So the planet projectors were inside the cage on the left there. And then there you can see the rough or the ring with some of those individual bright star projectors that were added as part of that Model 3 upgrade. I should also mention these were German crates. They were very obviously made in Germany. We found shipping labels. It's a little bit hard to read there, but from Carl Zeiss in Oberkochen to the Adler in Chicago. We then found additional shipping labels from the Adler to William T. Clark of Observadome, Jackson, Mississippi, and even from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, back up to Mechanicsburg, Ohio. The last crate that we found contained the Northern Hemisphere planet cage, which you can see there in remarkably good condition. And shoved inside there as packing material were bits of old newspaper. And sure enough, we started digging through the newspaper, and there we see Chicago Tribune, Sunday, December 21st, 1969. So all this was used as packing material when this planetarium left the Adler. And this was it. We felt pretty good before, but this was enough to convince us that, yes, this in fact was our Zeiss. So after a bit of back and forth, we settled on a price, purchased our projector back from the Greider family. We made 2 more trips back to the farm in June, and that allowed us to gather up some of the small pieces and accessories, and also to oversee the removal of the 4 crates. The large crate that was outside was in pretty rough shape. Our collections team estimated it probably wouldn't have made it more than a couple more years. It was already damaged. So the shipping company actually disassembled that crate, which gave us actually our first good look at the inside of the center axle there. And you can see that cobwebs and dust aside, it is actually in remarkably good shape, considering it sat outside for upwards of 30 years. Well, we then hoisted out that piece, and it was put into a new crate. And as we did that, we also found an interesting side piece. Written inside of that largest crate was a little note, a little Happy New Year message, including names and signatures from the folks at Zeiss in Oberkochen who had packed up the projector and then shipped it to Adler. So we made sure to carve that out of the crate before it was disassembled. Now, as to what is happening with it now, we have now shipped all those crates and all those pieces and parts to Adler's secure off-site storage location, where I can assure you the projector is being looked after by top men and women. We will soon be starting the process of how we want to approach restoration and public awareness of the project, with the final goal being reassembling the projector for display at the Adler. One last note, I do want to put in a thanks. Some work had already been done towards piecing together this timeline by Brent Sullivan, Gary Lazik, and Glenn Walsh. And much of that information was archived on Glenn Walsh's website. We were, however, able to kind of start with that and then fill in the pieces and determine what actually happened to our projector to bring it back together. Because that was kind of the mystery. The projector's location was known up to about the 1970s, and then it just sort of dropped off. But we were able to reconcile all the stories and bring them back together. All right. With that, I have not been keeping up with the chat. I have my apologies there, but Pedro, are there any questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. We have comments like, what an adventure, how cool, unbelievable, which I totally agree. I've been pleased also to be part of this process. And I think this story, and thinking also David's paper, this is also a good reminder of how the different lives of the same object, I mean, major attraction, first projector, modern planetarium projector in the Western Hemisphere, eventually a piece going into a path of obsolescence, then a collector in someone's barn, maybe, hopefully, in the near future, museum piece with which we'll tell the story. So, and there have been, and connecting with Katie's talk as well, some pieces, some buildings, some things might well disappear. So we need always to kind of find ways of reconverting and making these pieces relevant and preserving them. So thank you very much, Mike.
Sorry, Pedro.
You have an additional comment, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going through the comments, and I noticed this when I was writing up my notes, but Ryan Wyatt asked, the new moon projector only projected the new moon. No, so this was actually very interesting. In going through Adler's archives, we found conversation back and forth between Adler and Zeiss from the late 1930s into the 1950s, where Adler was expressing dissatisfaction with the quality of the moon projector that came with the original Zeiss. And obviously some of that time, as we learned in Katie's talk, Zeiss was in tatters. I'm not saying this discussion took that long because of anything that was their fault, but it turns out the moon projector that was shipped with the original Model 2 was just a disc. It did not have surface features detailed on it, and that was the source of our complaint. So that updated projector that was made available later had a more realistic moon image. that would allow it to, allowed you to see some surface feature on it. So I should say the original one, it was a disc projector. It was able to phase, but there was no surface textures on it. So that was, we were quite excited to get that updated moon projector for more accurate projection.
Thank you very much, Mike, and everyone for the comments. So we should probably move on to the next talk. So next we'll have Dave Hostetter from the Lafayette Science Museum in Louisiana. So this is actually, I understand this is a joint work with Dr. Deborah Clifton, but Dave will be the presenter. So Dave is a retired curator of the Planetarium of the Lafayette Science Museum. He was responsible for all aspects of planetarium operation and telescope observing, including supervision of one full-time and one shared assistant, plus some volunteers. So Dave has been working with the Lafayette Museum Collections curator to develop an accession collection of traditional planetary equipment, programs, and documentation. And he curated a small collection, an exhibit of meteorites, tektites, and shatter cones. And I suppose we'll hear a few things about this. So Dave, please.
All right. Let me see if I can share my screen here. I have never done this before, so I'm sure I'm going to mess this up. And I'm sure that's not what you're supposed to be seeing.
You should get a window where you can select what you want to share. There you go.
All right, hang on just a second here. How about that? Do you see the title?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right, so yeah, I should point out as I start that my colleague in this was Dr. Debbie Clifton, and she's our collections curator, basically the brains of this operation. I knew the planetarium stuff. She knows how to turn it into an accession collection, and we've made a pretty good team. So in 2012, we changed to a full dome planetarium at the Lafayette Science Museum. And so that raised the question of what to do with over 40 years of traditional equipment. And originally we planned to keep some of it, star projector in particular, Spitz A4, to place it on exhibit. But in planning to do that, we realized that we could do better. So at that time, I had been the curator of the planetarium there in Lafayette for 32 years. And we had the usual typical types of things like audio equipment, special effects projectors, a couple generations of control equipment. We had all of the slides and the scripts and production notes and all that stuff for every planetarium program that I had done since 1980. And of course, we had the usual thousands of slides in the collection that we used for astronomy and space education. We had started our museum in a different building. We even had some of the chairs from the original planetarium in the original building. There were equipment manuals. We had the Spitz Planetarium Director's Handbook, a special effects design handbook, which partly came from IPS. There was documentation of the design and construction of the original building and of the building in which the museum was now housed. There were planning documents for an observatory, planetarium images from the opening days in 1969, and a lot more. And we realized this wasn't just a bunch of stuff to discard. This was our institutional history, and we needed to preserve it. And it was also a snapshot of how small planetariums worked in the late 20th and early 21st century. So we had started out as a 30-foot dome. Now it was a 40-foot dome. So we started with the equipment that I planned to put in the exhibit, and the collection inventory looked at each object that we had, gave it an accession number. There were measurements of exactly what size it was and a physical description of it, and then a couple of paragraphs that would tell a little bit about how it was used in actual operation. And over a couple of years, this expanded so that the project now has the original collection inventory, 19 addenda of equipment that I've described, a vocabulary of technical terms for people who come later, a list of all our known planetarium staff members from 1969 to the present, an oral planetarium history that Debbie and I did last year about my tenure there from 1980 to the present. We had some things we didn't feel comfortable keeping or could not keep. The enlarger was just so big that we really didn't have a place to put it. We got photographs of it though. And the chemistry for our masking and things like that, we didn't really necessarily want to keep. We've got photographs of all that type of stuff, and there's a lot more yet to come. So it's getting to be kind of a complete type of archival thing for small planetariums. And a lot of questions have arisen. So for instance, how do we care for long-term electronics, computers and things like that, and lubricated projectors? Having them sit there for a couple of years is no big deal, but if we think about 50 or 100 years, how do you really care for things like that? Probably many of you will remember Kodak remote paddles, and it turns out that after a couple, 3 decades, the cables begin to ooze some kind of a green goo, and it seems to be related to the chemistry of the plastic in the cables themselves. We can't figure out how to arrest that. It doesn't seem to be flammable, but we're curious if anybody knows if that would be dangerous to other things in our collection. We're also curious about what to do with obsolete data formats. Do we need to find computers that can read things from 30 years ago? Or do we have to find some way to update it to update the information to something that can be read by modern computers? And we're curious who else is preserving and conserving planetarium equipment. We're starting to see some answers to that today. So that's really been pretty cool stuff that we've seen so far today. Now, we do have a new problem that has cropped up that's a really serious concern, and that is that the Lafayette Science Museum has been closed and will remain closed until November, at least. Most of the staff has been laid off. I was forced to retire. The current plan calls for the museum to endure a roughly 80% budget cut in the next fiscal year, running the place with only the director and some part-timers and some volunteers. Debbie's collection position might be restored, but there's been no discussion that I've heard of restoring the positions for the planetarium, education, or exhibits curators. I'm not sure who's going to be running the planetarium, if anybody will. Private funds for operating are being investigated in case municipal funds are not restored, but we need hundreds of thousands of dollars each year, and that's kind of hard to come up with 3 months of planning. So what's going to happen to all this work is completely unknown, but Debbie and I are continuing to work on it, and will continue to do so. So I hope that this has been of interest. If you have any questions or anything, those are our emails. Feel free to contact us. We'll be glad to talk to you about anything that you're interested in. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much indeed, Dave. And let me congratulate you and Debbie for your effort in preserving these materials. And you also touched some really important points here, challenges that we grapple with in the museum world. How do you preserve 20th century technical and scientific equipment, electronics, data formats? So thank you for bringing all of these issues into discussion.
It's been an interesting trip. This was a whole new, different kind of thing for me. And yeah, it's a different level of operation from Adler and the Smithsonian and all that type of stuff. But you know, the small planetariums are important, and I think we're doing a good thing here.
Absolutely. I don't know if there's any specific question for Dave. We should, if not, we thank you. Thanks again, Dave, and we'll move on. Well, I will now double as chair and speaker. So I'd like to tell you a bit about the collections of the Adler Planetarium. Actually, we have so much interesting and fascinating stuff at the Adler that there's no really time to go into detail into anything. So I'll try to actually share a Dropbox link to my slides, which you should see on the chat right now. So you can download my slides. And what we'll get is basically an overview of materials we have at the Adler Planetarium, which are of great interest, I suppose, to, well, not only the history of modern planetarium, but the history that comes before. And that's what I would like to address. So I'll just go over my presentation quickly. You already heard from Mike Smale a few bits about the history of the Adler. So the Adler was the first modern planetarium in the Western Hemisphere. It opened in 1930. So the Adler has a very rich history, which is quite well documented in our institutional archive. So we have plenty of archival materials, which include items as diverse as, for example, our very first admission ticket, our first ticket ever sold, which you can see on the left, a collection of thousands of historical photographs and thousands of letters and other documents of all sorts. But the Adler also happens to be, and I think we are quite a special case in that regard. We are an independent planetarium that has world-class collections of scientific instruments, rare books, prints, models, and other materials. What you see on your screen right now, that's the first guide of the Adler Planetarium, written by Philip Fox, the first director. This was published in the 1930s. And you see one of the images from the guide. So you see a model of an observatory, and then on the back you see the cabinets with the old scientific instruments. So the idea is that by the Adler acquired a collection of roughly 500 scientific instruments, then it grew over the years. And the idea was that by having the collection, the Adler would be more than a scientific show venue, if you will. It would be a proper museum of astronomy. And in fact, it was originally called Adler Planetarium and Astronomical Museum of Chicago. The collection was meant to give a big picture of the historical development of astronomy. But there are many pieces in the collections that actually are extremely important to understand, if you will, the prehistory of the modern planetarium itself. So when you think about the planetarium, and Katie mentioned at the beginning, we need to, of course, planetaria need to be culturally situated. But if you go at the very basics, so we have an optical mechanical projector, basically the centerpiece. And of course, if you think of the optical and the mechanical components of that modern machine, those components were already out there, had been for a long time. So we have several devices in our collections that actually help us understand that story. I'll just show you a few examples. So I saw in the comments that some people were discussing the word planetarium, what planetarium meant in the past. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, a planetarium was basically a mechanical model of the solar system, which was also called a nori. So here you see two very nice examples from our collections, both made in the 18th century. The one on the left is particularly special because it's the first machine that we know of that was made in the British tradition of ori making. So it's really an important and unique artifact. But we have others. Let me just go back. So the ori you see on the right is actually a Dutch, we would call that a grand ori because it shows all of the planets known at the time. And this is very similar to the ori that we see in the famous painting by Joseph Wright, which here appears in an engraving that we have in our works on paper collection. I'll also make the note that besides the devices, we also have this very rich material that help us understand the iconography of planetaria and how the planetarium became a symbol of astronomical education and also a symbol of how astronomy could provide, studying astronomy could provide for the betterment of individuals. For example, here you see two very nice illustrations from rare books in our rare book library, basically precisely conveying this image of the ori, or if you will, the 18th and the 19th century planetarium as a symbol of astronomical education. Of course, if you start studying the history of the ori itself, you will find connections with devices that existed before. And so if you want to have this big picture of those devices, you will have to study other kinds of things that we also have very well represented in our collections. For example, astrolabes. We have, I think I say, one of the best collections of astrolabes in the world, armillary spheres, and astronomical clocks. And so these devices are extremely important to see how the idea of having something that simulates the sky and astronomical phenomena comes about and evolves through time. Eventually, this technology will meet another technology that emerges in the 17th century, which is the magic lantern, which here you can see in an illustration from a book by Athanasius Kircher. And in the 18th century, as some people already mentioned in the comments, you will have these public lecturers that will use the magic lantern to basically, in many cases, travel around and give shows, basically a combination of science and spectacle public lectures that are illustrated with magic lantern slides. A very interesting type of material we have at the Adler, which sheds really interesting hints and clues about who these lecturers were, what did they talk about, what kind of devices they used, and who were their intended audiences. Are these kinds of broadsides, which are basically posters advertising those public lectures. So this is also a very rich kind of material. I don't have time to go into the details, but this could be the topic of an entire seminar. But I will make a note that there are some historians doing some really fascinating work on these public lectures. Here you see one kind of device that these public lecturers will also use. So this is a combination, the kind of combination between optics and mechanics that is essential to the modern planetarium projector. So this is a mechanical lantern slide. So it's basically a nori, and you get the principle. You put this on a projector, you crank it, and you can project a moving image, so the planets moving around the sun on a screen. This kind of optical tricks also got into the realm of didactic materials and optical toys. Of course, in the 19th century, there's a rising and an emerging middle class who's able to spend some money on these materials. And here you see two cards from a very famous set of constellation cards, originally published in 1825. It's called Uranus Mirror. So these are basically punch cards that if you place them against a source of light, the light will shine through the holes which correspond to the positions of stars. And this is the effect you get. I'll show you. So I put these two cards against the light box, and this is what you get. And of course, this is the kind of optical effect that will be used in the modern planetarium, the first modern planetarium projectors. And in fact, before of that, Katie already mentioned a piece that we certainly all did at the Adler, the Atwood sphere, which also has a fascinating history. So this is basically an immersive planetarium, a sphere which is precisely perforated. So it has 692 holes corresponding to the positions of stars. And so the light gets through. If you go inside, you get an image of the night sky as an observer at the latitude of Chicago would see. Then the sphere can rotate, so you can simulate the apparent motion of the celestial sphere. So this was made in 1913 under the auspices of the Chicago Academy of Sciences. Then the Adler basically killed it, made it irrelevant. But in the 1990s, the Adler made justice, brought it actually, now it was relocated to the Adler. And although we are close to the public right now at the moment, this has been a great attraction ever since. And I will make a note that this is another, it's a long and complex story, but fascinating. It's another case of one very special device, a very important historical piece that was on the verge of obsolescence. But fortunately, we turned it into a museum, living museum attraction. So I'll just end here. I'll just make a note. I think all of these kinds of devices and materials are very important to document the history of the planetarium, and if you will, the big picture history, so the broader context for the emergence of the modern planetarium. And I invite everyone to explore our collections online. So if you go to our website, we have a database and you'll find records and images for most of these materials. And I will stop here. Thanks very much. And I don't know if there are, oh, someone asking me personal favorites. We cannot have personal favorites, we are told. I mean, curators. But okay, so you will tell no one. I think I'll go, it will change. So today it will be the Graham Horry, that first story you saw, because it's such a fascinating piece when basically that creates a standard and it's a prototype for this long tradition of machines that will evolve throughout the 18th century. And I can tell you one of the perks of being a curator, you being able to be with that machine and of course with your gloves on, touch that machine is really something special. If you ask me tomorrow, I will say something different, but that's the one today. Okay, thanks very much. I think we should move on, getting short of time. Although this was the last talk on the program, actually we'll have an impromptu intervention by the leader of a fascinating project titled Spectacular Astronomy, Dr. Charlotte Big. Charlotte, I hope you're with us.
Yes, I am.
Hello, Charlotte. Wonderful to see you.
Pedro.
Thank you for being with us. And thank you very much for accepting to talk here, even though it was not possible to put you in the program. You've been doing wonderful things about the history of planetarium. That just tell us something about it, Charlotte, please.
Thank you. I have just a few slides, see if that works. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. Can you see that? Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Yeah, Pedro? Okay, so my name is Charlotte Big. I am a historian of science. I work at the French National Research Organization, CNRS, in Paris. Pedro asked me to speak very briefly about this project that I was involved with and in which Pedro also was involved with from about 2014 to a couple of years ago. And it was funded by the University of Lille and the University of Strasbourg in France, but also the French Ministry of Culture. The project is entitled Spectacular Astronomy, History and Future of Astronomical Performance, 19th to the 21st Century. And it started as a meeting between two disciplines, the history of science and the history of performance. So performance studies and theatre history, which both share an interest in some of the objects that Pedro has just shown. So lantern slides and the way they're used in entertainment context, but also in the context of popularization of science in the 19th century. Part of the interest was to confront our different perspectives of history of science and history of performance on these objects. But then we also worked together with the curator of the planetarium in Strasbourg. In Strasbourg, there's a wonderful, one of the first university planetaria that was created in the 1980s. And Strasbourg is in the process right now of building a new planetarium building and purchasing new equipment. But Strasbourg also has its own historical observatory, and the University of Strasbourg traditionally has spent a lot of effort and energy into keeping its heritage, so the buildings, the collections, the instruments generally, including what refers to astronomy. So for the University of Strasbourg, it was an interesting project to be involved with, to think about the ways in which astronomy, but also history of science, which are very much practiced in Strasbourg, could be involved in this new project of the university, but also in thinking about the technological equipment that the new planetarium should have, but also the kinds of shows that might be created in the future in the new planetarium. And we had also another set of actors, and those were artists. That is Eric Joris and crew from Brussels, who is a multimedia artist, and also Peter de Bruyser, who's a theatre playwright and actor. So the image I show you here, which you should look at in a sort of counterclockwise manner, summarize in a way one of the important strands of this project, which was to think about the experience of the planetarium, the experience of the solar system that is provided in some of the devices that we've already spoken about, but that sort of precede the planetarium. What kind of bodies, what kind of individuals, what kind of crowds, what kind of experience, both in terms of entertainment and in terms of learning, are provided by these large-scale devices that are orreries, ceiling orreries, the planetarium from the 1920s. And this work involved a lot of visits. So we also came to visit Pedro and came to see his wonderful collections in the Adler planetarium. Let me see if I can move on. The next one here. Here is Mylène, who's the head of the planetarium in Strasbourg, Benjamin, who's in charge of the technical equipment of the new planetarium, and Pedro showing us around at the Adler planetarium. So a lot of the work was around the material culture, the historical material culture. And this inspired our artists in residence, Eric and his crowd, to think about the human planetarium, which is an old tradition that goes back at least to Peter the Great, of people embodying planets, and so moving around, so one person being the sun, for instance, the others being planets, and moving around and impersonating the solar system, so to speak. And that is a tradition that has continued to an extent in pedagogical contexts. Eric Joris is someone who was very much involved in the development and exploration of technologies of virtual reality and immersive virtual reality. And so he developed himself, so before, a couple of years ago, before we had these VR glasses that you could buy, an interactive, immersive solar system that one could look around. And what was quite surprising and interesting at the same time is that these performances that he set up, and you see me here with my avatar because we were very much involved in the making of this project also, is that it wasn't meant to create a ready-made product for a planetarium, which it can be eventually, but the idea really was to explore the technology, to explore the ways in which we can think about astronomy using technology that is itself in progress. And we met quite a lot of interest on the part of planetarians in Europe who came to visit us. This is the play that came out of the project. So Peter de Bruysa wrote a play for planetariums with an intricate set of newfangled instruments that he built himself. And this play is probably not touring, but was supposed to be touring in several planetariums around Europe. And it was a wonderful way of connecting also with contemporary artistic theatrical creation. This is the more conventional academic product of the project, which includes an article by Pedro on the Adler Planetarium, and which showcases and reflects upon the different methods for studying spectacular astronomy from the 19th century to now. So we have contributions by media archaeologists, by performance studies people, by historians of science and historians of theatre. And at least the introduction, I think, is available without paying. So that's it. And I wanted to thank you so much for your presentations and all the efforts that all of you are putting into keeping and preserving planetarium technology and paper and information about resources, because really this is the material we need in order to write future histories. And I think the history of the planetarium needs to be in the history of science and the history of science popularization and of spectacle. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Wonderful presentation and wonderful way of wrapping up. We have a few minutes for a channel discussion, and I have to say, when I took that question about the favorite item, actually I skipped on purpose a question that was before, which I think it's basically the fundamental question, which is, what do you find most important about collecting the items information? I think you, Charlotte, basically just addressed that. But I think it's important to go back to this question. I would like to ask the speakers for this session to share their thoughts on this question. So I'll read it again. What you find most important about collecting the items, these items information? Katie, do you want to go first?
It's a great question, and I think it's a big question, and I want to piggyback off of what Charlotte said, which is that without recording this kind of thing, we have to understand where these things come from and why, on a very basic level, why we like these things, why these things are appealing, how these things evolve, because it tells us so much about not just the material itself, but it tells us so much about how we, as people, interact with the world and think about our relationship to space, outer space, city space, inner space, however you want to define that. And preserving this kind of material, you need it to give that kind of context. Yeah, I mean, it seems like, especially working on stuff that has been destroyed or disappeared, I understand very, very keenly the importance of whatever scraps you can put together and preserve is incredibly important for this kind of research.
Thank you, Katie. David. Is David still around?
David, you're muted.
David, do you want to share very briefly your thoughts on this?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, why do we collect it all? And of course, the nature of collection is really to preserve the culture that we are, you might say, a product of, and to understand how what we have today is a product of what was in the past. Collecting material objects, we believe, is the most important or most valuable way to say, yes, this particular function, this particular mechanism actually existed. And here it is. There is some curators say that artifacts interpret themselves or speak for themselves. I'm not one of them. The only thing an artifact will tell you is, I existed. And I think that is a very important thing in our postmodern culture to work for. In the case of the planetarium, simply put, it is any kind of cultural or architectural things. I know that Katie has done a wonderful job of understanding the, or at least appreciating and communicating the how the planetarium shows are culturally dependent. Jun Xin has shown how they can be used as devices to sell other devices when the particular program is highly desired by a nation. So they represent something. They say at some point in time, I existed, and for this reason.
Thank you, David. Mike.
Yeah, not much that hasn't really already been stated by Katie and David, but just the fact that these objects are this, pun intended, sort of lens as to how we can, interpret the past, where we are, where we were, combine that with where we are, where we're going. I mean, it's all part of the human condition. So.
Thank you, Mike. Dave, do you want to add some thoughts?
Well, one of the things I think that has interested us in our collection and gotten us started is that this is stuff from small planetariums rather than the really big ones. And I think that that's an important aspect of it. Another thing that I think is important that we're about to start working more seriously on is the archival stuff. Aside from the physical collection of projectors and things like that, we've got all this documentation from 40 years of working in the planetarium programs, the list of programs we did, which with the slides and everything else, the scripts and so forth, kind of gives you a feel for how different aspects of astronomy were presented differently from 1980 to 2020, basically. So I think that there are some archival things that we're going to be doing that will be of interest also, and the aspect of doing things with a small planetarium, which they really are different than the big planetariums. So I think that those are a couple of aspects that we think are important.
Thank you very much, David. You make a very important point, which is this shouldn't be just the history of the big players and the big institutions and the usual suspects. So once again, congratulations for the wonderful work.
Oh, thank you.
Of the history at your planetarium. Well, we're running out of time. Charlotte, I think you did such a wonderful summary by the end of your talk that I don't know if you want to add something.
Yes, just one thing. One of the most amazing things I found in the archives, and those are the archives of the French planetarium of the Palais de la Découverte from 1937, are scripts of shows with annotations about what you show. And so, having you all here is so wonderful, because I think you were talking about archives, and I think it's also really important to have the objects, but also to know what was done with the objects, and the content of the shows changes quite a lot over the period. And I think it's really useful also if you have recordings or if you have scripts to get a sense also of the kinds of things that were said and the kinds of experiences that were made, the kinds of publics. And that would be really helpful, I think, for writing the history of Planetaria in the future.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Charlotte, and everyone. I will just add very briefly that one aspect that as a curator fascinates me, besides all of the things that have been said so far, is the immense potential to tell stories, to share this story, learn about it, of course, but then being able to present it to others too. And I think it's totally different to talk about something or to have a material or documental connection with something. And this might be a good topic for maybe a follow-up webinar. How do we tell the stories of the planetarium? So I'd like to thank the IPS, Mark Subarau, all of the speakers and everyone who connected today for a really wonderful session. Again, please get in touch if you'd like to get involved with the working group. And this is to be continued. Thank you very much, everyone.